Most people think the power grid is the thing that keeps America running. It is not. The grid is just the last visible piece of a much older, quieter system, one built out of habits, objects, and decisions that most families never think about until the lights go out and that entire hidden system stops working all at once. Underneath the wires and substations, there are 11 smaller systems running inside ordinary homes, doing for a single family what utilities, water plants, banks, and supply chains do for an entire country. Today, we are counting down those 11 quiet systems, the ones that hold a household together when the visible one fails. And by the time we reach number 1, you will realize the most important system in your house was never electric at all. This is not a doomsday warning. It is a calm, practical look at what actually keeps people steady when the power does not come back on schedule. Quick note before we get into it. A large share of the people watching this are doing it on a television rather than a phone. So if you are one of them, subscribing or sharing this with someone who might need it does more for a channel like this than almost anything else. It is genuinely what decides whether research like this keeps getting made. Now, let's get into it. Number 11 is light, and not the kind people think of first. Most households own flashlights, but most of those flashlights are buried in a junk drawer with dead batteries, which means the real failure point is not the absence of light. It is the absence of access to light in the first 3 seconds of darkness. The Consumer Product Safety Commission has tracked a recurring pattern after storms and outages. Falls on stairs, in bathrooms, and in unfamiliar hallways spike sharply in the hours immediately following a blackout, especially among older adults navigating a home they normally move through on autopilot. This is the part most people miss. It is not the dark itself that hurts people. It is the layout of a familiar house suddenly behaving like an unfamiliar one. Smart households keep a light source within arm's reach of every bed, not in a closet 2 rooms away, because the seconds right after the power cuts are exactly when someone is most likely to be standing, walking, or holding something breakable. The mistake beginners make is buying one flashlight and storing it in the same place as the candles, which brings its own problem. The National Fire Protection Association has documented a measurable rise in home fires tied to unattended candles during outages, because people reach for an open flame as a default without thinking about what happens if they fall asleep, or if a pet knocks it over in a dark room. The smarter substitute is something boring: battery-powered lanterns or headlamps positioned at the exact spots a family already passes through in the dark. That sounds small, almost too obvious to mention, until the moment the power cuts at 10 at night and a parent is the only thing standing between a toddler and a staircase. And that leads to something most people do not connect to light at all: the question of how anyone in the house will know what is actually happening outside the walls. Number 10 is information, specifically a way to receive it that does not depend on the same grid that just failed. Cell towers run on backup batteries that are not designed to last indefinitely, and during extended outages, networks become congested fast as everyone in the same blackout zone tries to call, text, and stream updates at once. The Federal Communications Commission has repeatedly flagged this congestion problem after major storms, noting that cellular service often degrades hours before it fully fails, giving people a false sense that communication is still reliable right up until it is not. A battery-powered or hand-crank radio capable of receiving NOAA weather radio broadcasts solves a problem most people do not think about until they are already in the dark, wondering whether the outage is local or regional, whether it will last an hour or 3 days, and whether there is a storm still coming behind it. This is where beginners make a mistake. They assume a phone with a charged battery is enough, without accounting for the fact that the towers themselves, not just the phone, are part of the failure. 3 hours into a real outage, a working radio does not feel like an old-fashioned backup anymore. It feels like the only honest source of information left in the house, when every screen in the building is either dead or guessing. But knowing what is happening outside does not help much if the next problem is happening inside the walls, somewhere most people never think to check. Number 9 is sanitation. And this is the one almost nobody plans for, because it sounds unpleasant to even bring up. During the September 2011 Southwest blackout, which knocked out power across San Diego County, parts of Arizona, and northern Mexico for nearly 12 hours, the city's sewer pump stations lost power along with everything else, and several million gallons of wastewater were released into local waterways before backup systems could compensate. That is not a household problem on its own, but it is a preview of something that happens at a smaller scale inside homes on private septic systems, or anywhere relying on an electric pump, where a prolonged outage can mean a toilet that simply stops working the normal way. The Environmental Protection Agency recommends households on well or septic systems understand exactly how their setup depends on electricity, because the moment people realize the bathroom is non-functional is usually the same moment they realize how unprepared they were for it. A simple stock of heavy-duty bags, basic sanitation supplies, and a clear plan for manual operation during an outage is not glamorous, but it is the difference between a manageable inconvenience and an actual health hazard within 48 hours. This is not about fear. It is about options. Because the families who never think about this are the same ones improvising in the worst possible way on day 2. And once sanitation is handled, the next quiet system is the one most people assume will simply take care of itself. The food already sitting in the refrigerator. Number 8 is the cold chain, the invisible network of refrigerated trucks, warehouses, and store coolers that keeps food safe between a farm and a kitchen, and which a home refrigerator is really just the last, smallest link of. The United States Department of Agriculture is specific about the math here. A full freezer holds safe temperatures for about 48 hours if left unopened, a half-full one for about 24, and a refrigerator itself starts becoming risky after about 4 hours without power, especially for anything involving dairy, meat, or leftovers. Most people miss this because the food still looks and smells fine, well past that window, which is exactly the trap. Spoilage from temperature is often invisible until someone is already sick. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has linked a noticeable share of post-storm foodborne illness directly to people eating from refrigerators that lost power for longer than they realized, often because nobody actually tracked the time. The simple, almost embarrassingly cheap fix is an appliance thermometer kept inside the fridge and freezer at all times, paired with a cooler and a bag of ice bought before, not after. A storm warning goes out. That sounds small until day 2 of an outage when half the neighborhood is quietly throwing away groceries they cannot afford to replace, while the household that planned ahead is calmly eating exactly what they expected to eat. And that price anxiety, the sinking feeling of watching food go to waste, connects directly to the next system, the one tied to money itself. Number 7 is cash, plain paper currency, which sounds almost old-fashioned until the exact moment digital payment systems stop cooperating. During the 2011 Southwest blackout, ATMs and card readers across San Diego went dark along with everything else. And for nearly half a day, cash was effectively the only functioning payment system in a major American city. The Federal Reserve has noted in its own guidance on disaster preparedness that electronic payment networks depend on the same power and internet infrastructure that storms and outages routinely disrupt, which means a fully charged phone with a banking app on it can become functionally useless within minutes of a blackout if the merchant's card reader has no power either. This is where careless buyers and smart buyers really diverge, not in how much money they have, but in whether any of it exists in a form that still works without electricity. A modest amount of small denomination cash kept at home, separate from a wallet that might be lost or left behind, is one of the cheapest forms of resilience a household can build. And it solves a problem that no amount of saving in a bank account actually addresses during the first chaotic hours of an outage. This is not about distrust of banks. It is about understanding that the banking system and the power grid are more connected than most people ever stop to consider. But money only helps if a person is healthy enough to use it, which brings the countdown to something far more personal. Number 6 is medication continuity. a phrase that sounds clinical until it becomes the most urgent thing in the house. The Food and Drug Administration and the CDC have both pointed out that pharmacy supply chains, much like grocery supply chains, depend on continuous power for refrigeration, point-of-sale systems, and inventory tracking, which means a regional outage can quietly disrupt prescription refills days before anyone notices empty shelves at the pharmacy counter. Families with members who depend on insulin, heart medication, oxygen concentrators, or other daily prescriptions are the ones who feel this fastest. And during the 2011 Southwest blackout, emergency rooms across San Diego saw a real increase in patients dependent on oxygen equipment, who had no backup power source for their devices once home batteries ran out. This is the part nobody thinks about until the moment matters most. A basic plan, knowing exactly which medications cannot be interrupted, keeping a several-day backup supply where prescriptions allow it, and having a battery or backup power option for anything medically essential is not paranoia. It is the same logic hospitals use when they run their own backup generators. The families who handle this calmly are not the ones with the most supplies. They are the ones who actually wrote down what their household specifically needs before they needed it. And once a family's health needs are covered, the next system is what keeps that backup power flowing in the first place. Number 5 is portable power, the household's own miniature version of what a grid operator does every single day, deciding what gets electricity first. When there is not enough to go around for everything at once, a power bank or small battery station will not run an entire home. And trying to make it does is exactly the mistake beginners make, draining a single battery on a space heater or a television instead of reserving it for what actually matters: a phone, a medical device, or the radio carrying the next weather update. During the December 2022 cold outbreak known as Winter Storm Elliott, the Tennessee Valley Authority was forced into rolling blackouts for the first time in its 90-year history, deliberately cutting power to some homes for short windows, specifically to prevent a larger, longer collapse of the entire regional grid. That is the exact same logic a household should apply to a single charged battery, rationing it deliberately rather than letting it die on something convenient but unnecessary. This is where timing matters more than quantity. A battery charged in advance, before a storm watch even becomes a warning, is worth more than 3 batteries bought in a panic after the lights are already out and every shelf in town is empty. But even perfect power management does not solve the most basic need of all, the one utilities cannot help with directly: water. Number 4 is water. And this is where most people discover how much they were quietly depending on a public system they never see. Municipal water treatment plants and the pumps that move water through pipes typically run on the same electrical grid as everything else. And the EPA has noted that prolonged outages can affect both water pressure and, in some cases, treatment processes themselves, which is part of why public health agencies recommend boiling or otherwise treating water during extended disruptions, even when it still looks clear coming out of the tap. The recommendation from FEMA and the CDC is consistent: roughly 1 gallon per person per day for drinking and basic hygiene, stored in advance rather than purchased during a panic. Because bottled water is reliably one of the first items to disappear from shelves the moment a storm warning is issued. This is the part most families discover the hard way: that food can wait a day, but water cannot. And the household that stored even a modest amount weeks earlier is not standing in a parking lot fighting over the last case on a shelf. 3 days into an outage, water does not feel like a grocery item anymore. It feels like the only thing standing between a normal inconvenience and an actual emergency. And once water and power are accounted for, the next system is the one almost nobody associates with preparedness at all: temperature regulation of the human body itself. Number 3 is thermal control, staying warm or staying cool without the system that normally does it automatically. The same August 2020 heat wave that pushed California's grid operator into rotating outages across hundreds of thousands of homes is a useful mirror image of what Winter Storm Elliott did to the Southeast a little over 2 years later. One event driven by extreme heat, the other by extreme cold, both forcing utilities to deliberately cut power because demand had outrun supply. In both cases, the households that struggled most were not necessarily the ones without air conditioning or heating. They were the ones with no plan for what to do when that system simply was not available for several hours at a time. The CDC has been direct about this risk. Both heat-related illness and hypothermia can develop indoors, not just outdoors, when a home loses climate control during an extreme weather event. And the people most vulnerable are often the ones least likely to say anything until it is already serious. The very young, the elderly, and anyone with an existing health condition. A small set of inexpensive items, layered blankets, a few cooling towels, a battery-powered fan, solves more of this problem than people expect. But the real value is in the habit of checking on the most vulnerable person in the house first, before checking anything else. This is where beginners make a mistake, assuming the danger is the storm outside, when the actual danger is often a quiet, gradual change in temperature inside a closed-up house that nobody is monitoring. And once the body is protected, the last physical layer of the countdown is the one that ties every previous item together: the ability to actually reach the rest of the family. Number 2 is coordination, the household's own version of the dispatch centers and emergency communication protocols that utilities and local governments rely on during a crisis. After the 2011 Southwest blackout, investigators noted that one of the biggest sources of public confusion was not the outage itself, but the lack of a clear, agreed-upon way for separated family members to reconnect and confirm safety once cell networks became unreliable. FEMA has built an entire framework around this exact gap, recommending that every household establish a written family communication plan in advance, a designated out-of-area contact who is easier to reach than someone local, a specific meeting location if home is not accessible, and a clear order of who checks on whom first, if family members are scattered across different parts of a town or city when an outage hits. This sounds almost too simple to matter, until the actual moment it is needed. When one parent is at work, one child is at school, another relative is across town, and every phone in the chain is competing for the same congested, half-functioning network. The families who handle this calmly are never the ones improvising in real time. They are the ones who decided the plan weeks earlier, wrote it down, and made sure every person in the household, including kids old enough to understand it, knew it without having to ask. And that quiet decision, made long before any storm warning existed, is the bridge to the final and most important item on this list. Number 1 is not a product at all. It is the decision, made in advance, about what actually matters most when a family cannot have everything at once. Every grid operator in this countdown, from the one managing the 2011 Southwest blackout to the one running Winter Storm Elliot's rolling outages, was doing the exact same thing in those critical hours, deciding what gets power first, what can wait, and what has to be sacrificed temporarily so the larger system does not collapse completely. A household facing its own blackout is making an identical decision on a smaller scale, whether anyone admits it or not, and the families who come through it calmly are the ones who made that decision before the emergency, not during it. They already know which device gets the battery first, which family member gets checked on first, which supplies are for day 1 and which are rationed for day 3, because they sat down once on an ordinary afternoon with the power still on and actually talked it through. That is the real difference between the household that panics and the household that simply adjusts. It was never about owning more things. It was about deciding ahead of time in what order those things matter. Preparedness is not panic. Panic is simply what happens when that decision never got made. The goal here was never to make anyone afraid of the dark. It was to show that the same quiet, deliberate decision-making holding up the entire American power grid is something every household can borrow on a smaller scale, long before the next outage forces the question. And if these are the 11 things quietly keeping a family steady when the lights go out, the next question is even bigger, because none of this matters for very long without something sitting in the kitchen the entire time, waiting. What happens to a household's food supply? Not in the first 3 days of an outage, but if the disruption stretches into weeks, is a different problem entirely, and it deserves its own complete answer.